Hello, I'm Tara Hooper from Plymouth Marine Laboratory, and I'm going to be talking a bit about the natural capital approach, and in particular, how we're developing a method to apply this to sustainability appraisal. So the natural capital approach started probably a good couple of decades ago, really, with international programs such as the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, which led in the UK to our own UK National Ecosystem Assessment in 2011, and also the Environment White Paper. And these really started to bring into common usage these ideas of the value of nature and of ecosystem services and what nature does for us. And from the White Paper, that led directly to the formation of the Natural Capital Committee, and also to a commitment to have regular natural capital accounts within the UK's wider national accounting. And of course, now we have 25-year environment plan, which contains the explicit commitment that the UK intends to use a natural capital approach as a tool to help us make key choices and long-term decisions. What exactly is the natural capital approach? Where it comes from is this idea of the 5 capitals model, which has been around in sustainable development for quite a long time. And what that is it contains financial capital, which obviously is what most of us think of as capital, so financial resources. But also on top of that, there's manufactured capital, so infrastructure and things that we make. There's also our human capital, our individual skills and knowledge, and the social capital, which is our collective experience and how we come together as societies and networks. Then around all of this is this idea of natural capital. And the diagram is like this for a reason, because without our natural resources, none of the rest of it would be possible. But this is where sort of some of the terminology starts to get a little confused, because while natural capital is often used as an overarching term to describe the whole approach, it also is used more specifically to describe environmental assets. So that's the ocean, land, fresh water, the habitats and species, which are also sometimes referred to as stocks. And then from natural capital, we get ecosystem services. And these are the components of natural environment that are directly useful to us. And there have been concepts put forward previously about things like intermediate services or supporting services as a way to try and highlight that all elements of nature, whether they're directly useful to us or not, should be considered services because they are so important in the chain of our well-being. However, that's actually quite difficult to operationalise. And so the way things are moving now is that any processes, functions, supporting services, intermediate services are all brought together within the concept of natural capital assets. And the ecosystem services are explicitly those components that are directly useful to us. And they're usually divided in, they can be referred to as flows. They're usually divided into 3 categories. There are provisioning services, which is food and raw materials; regulating services, which is how the environment helps protect us from harm, so how it absorbs pollution, how it protects from flooding and erosion. And then there are cultural services, which is how our interactions with the environment shape our experiences, so recreation, inspiration, heritage, for example. And from ecosystem services, we then take products or otherwise have benefits that increase our welfare from using and enjoying nature. And natural capital and ecosystem services, they are provided by the natural environment, whereas in order to access goods and benefits, we need other inputs, whether that's infrastructure and equipment for mining to extract aggregates, or whether it's the skills and knowledge of fishermen so they know where to put their pots. It's also possible to have human input to augment ecosystem services, so using fertilizer, for example, in agriculture, using forestry methods, or putting in infrastructure for aquaculture. But the key point is that the ecological endpoint here, because natural capital and ecosystem services, they're provided by the environment whether we use them or not. But then there's human intervention required to access the goods and benefits. Now, there are different ways to measure the different parts of the natural capital system. Sort of on the left-hand side, the natural capital assets and the ecosystem services, they're measured in sort of traditional ecological terms, using biological, physical and chemical units such as area, volume, frequency and density. But where a lot of excitement around the natural capital approach has been generated is in this idea of valuation, so of reporting the relative importance of nature in monetary or other terms that reflect its value. And the reason for this is valuation was seen as a way of reframing the importance of nature. And so addressing the fact that up until this point, because these values haven't been explicit and it hasn't actually been a requirement that people have had to pay to use the environment, so as a result, it's been undervalued and overexploited. And so by actually starting to put figures on the value of the environment, it's then easier for decision makers to make those trade-offs between the environment and the other things that society values. And these monetary values are starting to be used in things like national natural capital accounts. So now the Office for National Statistics publishes accounts that cover provisioning services, so that's things like agricultural biomass, fish, renewables, also regulating services, so things like carbon sequestration and pollution removal, and also cultural services. I mean, this particular graph on the right shows the value of time spent in various different natural environments. And that also highlights the fact that actually our national natural capital accounts haven't gone marine yet, and they only go as far as coastal margins. And progress is being made around marine accounts though. So there was a report last year by JNCC and CFAS which looked at some initial natural capital accounts for the UK marine and coastal environments, and so actually started to put values on some specific types of habitat. And it's not just at the national level that natural capital accounts are being produced. There's corporate accounts such as this one for the RSPB's nature reserves, but also a lot of local authorities are starting to produce natural capital accounts for their green spaces. And also monetary values are used in cost benefit analysis and as a means of justifying the investment that we need in our natural environment. So this example comes from the Natural Capital Committee talking about a managed realignment project in the Solent, and demonstrates that by creating salt marsh, you not only save the costs required for grey engineering infrastructure, but all the additional benefits that you get through the creation of new habitat actually means that the benefits of the project far exceed the project costs. And a final use of monetary values is in this idea of payment for ecosystem services. 25-year environment plan talks about this idea of public money for public goods, and obviously being able to value those public goods, being able to value the ecosystem services is a way of calculating what the level of subsidy should be. There are, as is so often the case, particular challenges in the marine environment, and one of these is a lack of valuation data. And this example is the impact assessment for the second tranche of marine conservation zones. If you just look at the headline figures, that suggests that actually there's a negative cost to establishing MCZs. But the reason that headline figure comes out as negative is because while it's quite easy to put a monetary value on the costs, it's much harder to put a monetary value on the benefits. So therefore that wasn't done, and hence you come out with a negative figure, even though there are lots of positive benefits to be had from the creation of marine protected areas. Also, more broadly, there are reasons why people don't think that monetary valuation is actually a good idea. Some of these are moral, just the broad idea that we should follow a utilitarian philosophy, and that you can actually decide whether something is right or wrong purely by deciding, so long as at least one person is better off, therefore the intervention must be right. Obviously people think that that isn't the appropriate way to justify policy decisions, because of course decisions are more complicated than that, and you have to look at issues like equity and fairness and justice, and reducing that to a single net utility figure isn't the way to address complex decisions. There's also the moral argument that if it starts to become an entirely transactional arrangement, people will expect financial reward for acting in an appropriate way, rather than just being motivated to act because it's the right thing to do. There are also conceptual arguments, particularly around the monetary values that are derived using techniques called stated preference, which is basically where you ask people what they value. And the conceptual arguments there are that actually the values that people state when they give you an intention to pay aren't actually equivalent to kind of market prices and wealth and economic welfare measures, and so you can't actually put them in a cost benefit framework with normal market prices. And then of course there's the practical issue, which is particularly important in the marine environment, is that there is currently a lack of valuation information, and it's questionable whether it's actually an appropriate use of resources to go out and actually put values and everything, whereas potentially that resource could be used around making decisions in a different way. But also, One of the issues around this focus on monetary valuation and on natural capital accounts is that it's possibly missing the bigger picture. I use this table quite a lot, and it was put together by the World Bank's Wealth Accounting and Valuation of Ecosystem Services program. So, it's put together by economists, not by sort of ecologists on the fringes who have opposition to valuation. And their point is that at the moment we're spending too much time focusing on how to get natural capital's methods and data right, and that natural capital accounts are kind of, if we can do them the right way, that's kind of seen as being a magic bullet, a way to support individual policy decisions. But really their point is that we should be moving towards just actually deciding what our natural capital policy should be and getting that right, using it as an opportunity to expand policy discourse, and using accounts in a complementary toolbox that gives us a comprehensive and routine way of assessing the natural capital system. And so that's why, as well as the valuation, which is an important part of the approach, we need to bring back in the things that are on the left-hand side. So the condition assessment, the more standard ecological metrics for natural capital, measuring natural capital and ecosystem services. And then what that does is it opens up a whole suite of decision-making processes which can apply in the natural capital approach. So things like environmental impact assessment, sustainability appraisal, as well as accounts and regulatory impact assessment. And that's what we've been trying to do through the SWEEP programme, is look at some of these other approaches that you can use as part of the wider natural capital system. And SWEEP is the Southwest Partnership for the Environment and Economic Prosperity, which is a 5-year Natural Environment Research Council funded science impact programme led by the University of Exeter, but with partners, the University of Plymouth and PML, and also non-academic partners, including statutory nature conservation bodies, industry and NGOs. And it has 5 themes all about different aspects of natural capital. So safeguarding natural capital in order to increase resilience, restoring natural capital for economic and social benefit, and also looking at new markets for natural capital in order to boost business. And the area that we're working particularly is around this idea of mainstreaming natural capital approaches for the public and private sector, and also integrated policymaking for natural capital-led growth. And what we're doing specifically in that area is exploring options for incorporating natural capital approaches into local decision-making. Because of course, a lot of this push for the natural capital approach is very top-down. And so it needs to be examined how it might actually work in practice at the local decision-making level. And there are some issues with the current system, particularly that it's one-dimensional. And what I mean by that is strategic environmental assessment and also sustainability appraisal are very much led by what is in the Strategic Environmental Assessment Directive and in its annex, which is this list on the left of things that your SEA and sustainability appraisal needs to consider. So biodiversity, flora, fauna, etc. So what tends to happen then is the way that that information is reported is under headings based upon that list. And while it's very important information and it still needs to be collected and presented, doing so in this way isn't actually the most useful way to present information about connected system and about trade-offs. And what I mean by a connected system is in reality what the natural capital system looks like is more like this, where on the left you have your assets, so those are biotic assets, so habitats and species, as well as the abiotic assets, so the water and the substrates that support them. And also in this area of environmental inputs, we've also added heritage assets, which is slightly departing from the usual perspective on natural capital, but because we have such a historic relationship with our environment and people have been shaping our environment for thousands of years, it's actually important that we consider heritage at the asset level and not just as a cultural ecosystem service. And then your assets, together with other forms of capital, like infrastructure, like human, social and financial capital, provides us with regulating, provisioning and cultural services and produces goods and benefits. And there's also interacted with other services which have nothing to do or no discernible connection with the environment. And of course, our exploitation of these goods and benefits leads to impacts on our environmental inputs as opposed to external factors such as climate change. And then across all of this, there's already assistance of governance, of regulations, of management plans, of strategies and designations that try to manage it all. And so reporting environmental impact assessment in a framework that reflects those complex and interconnected realities, I think is more useful in terms of decision making. So there's also an issue, I think, with the outputs that are provided from sustainability appraisal and similar impact assessment, in that a lot of it is very long reports with a lot of text. And while there is absolutely a need for that, there's also a need to better summarise the headline results from these kind of reports and assessments. And I really like this output that was England's National Nature Reserve accounts, because there you have on a 2-page spread all the summary information about your ecosystem assets, your services, and your benefits and values, including things like scoring for the significance of the services and benefits, and an assessment of confidence. And those kind of summary tables should really be on the top of all kinds of impact assessments. And finally, going forward, different elements of the system need to link together better, because of course on the one hand you've got the environmental impact assessment processes and tools, so whether that's the strategic level, site level, and things like the new biodiversity 2.0 metric, which will relate to net gain. And then of course you've got all sorts of different processes happening on the natural capital side, whether it's the development of, for example, Scotland's Natural Capital Asset Index, there's Natural England's work on indicators, and DEFRA is enabling a natural capital approach. And at the moment, these systems, within and between the two different sides don't really talk to each other well, and there needs to be a better way, some standardized protocols, so that there is better integration between the different parts of the system. So the way we went about setting up this project was we got together a group of stakeholders in a workshop to ask them, and we said, we would like to help you use the natural capital approach in local decision making. What would you like us to do? And so we had a workshop with local authorities, the MMO, Natural England, and the Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authority, and the North Devon Biosphere Reserve. And we did that around two contexts. So we looked on the one hand at individual development, so the marine licensing and planning consents, and then on the other hand at strategic planning of marine areas. The consensus was that sustainability appraisal was the most appropriate area to focus on, because it's a key tool in local planning, but also it provides a flexible framework to allow new approaches. For those not familiar with sustainability appraisal, it's an important statutory process. You have to do one. If you're doing a local plan, a neighbourhood plan, a marine plan, it is there in the law that you're required to do a sustainability appraisal to assess the environmental, social and economic implications of plans and programmes. And so what we're doing within our project is developing guidance and tools for using a natural capital approach in sustainability appraisal. And we've looked primarily at 3 case studies. So that's the marine plans, in particular the Southwest Marine Plan, the North Devon Torres Local Plan, and also recently developed North Devon Marine Natural Capital Plan. So just to flag up, this method is still in development. It's based on natural capital concepts and theory, and the examination of existing guidance and tools, as well as obviously looking at how the sustainability appraisal process occurs, looking at examples from local plans and marine plans and so on. There is an ongoing iterative process to refine it, and I'm still taking feedback as I develop the final method. Of course, the first thing to think about is, because sustainability appraisal is a statutory process, if we change the way that information is framed, are we still going to fulfill the statutory obligations? And so on the left here are the topics that are in the Strategic Environmental Assessment Annex 1, which also is translated into UK planning law as well. And then on the right are the different elements in our natural capital system. And the answer is yes, of course, they all do fit together. They map onto each other very well. And that wasn't just me drawing some lines together. I actually went through the sustainability appraisal scoping that was done for the Southwest Marine Plan and connected each one of the subtopics that they had identified, each component of each subtopic, to the natural capital system elements. And they map in multiple ways. And really that shouldn't be a surprise, because all the natural capital approach is doing is reframing environmental information. It's not suddenly talking about areas of the environment that we didn't know existed before. Now, the sustainability appraisal has a fixed process. It has methods that have been developed, and it's undertaken in a particular way. And there are 5 key stages in that process. So the first of which is setting the context and objectives and establishing the baseline, deciding on the scope. And the second, defining and refining alternatives. So that's your option appraisal, comparing different options within your plan. And then you need to prepare a report, to consult on it, and to monitor and report after the plan's been adopted. And where our work focuses focuses on those first two stages, because obviously the need to produce a report, the need to consult, the need to monitor and evaluate doesn't change just because we framed the underlying environmental information in a slightly different way. And just to stress that that's exactly what we're doing, is proposing an alternative framing for the way that information is collected and presented. We're not proposing a complete overhaul of the sustainability appraisal process, because ripping it all up and starting it again would not be sensible. So within those two initial stages, there are then some individual steps where we're proposing certain tools or approaches for each one of those. Again, not all of them need changing. There's things within that, for example, again, another consultation step that you don't need to change. But what we are proposing is using the 5 capitals model as a way to identify the sustainability appraisal, and then using an asset register, an ecosystem service inventory, and various classification hierarchies as the framing through which baseline information is collected. Then a risk register to identify sustainability issues and problems. And finally, proposing particular data and indicators which can be used to develop the sustainability appraisal, because the full sustainability appraisal framework has the objectives, but also has indicators against which progress is measured. And then within stage B, the option appraisal stage, we're going to produce a framework to show how you can evaluate the different plan options on natural capital assets and ecosystem services. But that stage is still to come. We've been focusing on the scoping stage so far. So the first stage, using the 5 capitals model. And the purpose of this is to break down overarching objectives into their constituent parts. And that allows you to do a better job of developing specific indicators and targets. Because at the moment, a lot of the objectives in sustainability appraisal are quite high level and quite vague. So those two on the right there, reduce waste generation and disposal to achieve the sustainable management of waste and manage and adapt to climate change. You know, those are genuine objectives from local plans. But if you break them down into their constituent elements across natural, manufactured, human and social capital, then you can start to produce more specific objectives, but also to make sure that your objectives are addressing, you know, the environment, the economy and society. So for example, splitting down this overarching objective about waste generation and disposal, you need to look at the ability of the environment to accommodate the discharge of pollution, you know, the availability and suitability of waste processing facilities, how to encourage behaviour change, and how community and business groups can actually be used to help facilitate that behaviour change. And then there needs to be an evidence base, your baseline of environmental, social and economic information, which is used to support your objectives and then to monitor. And what we're proposing is a database of linked sheets. And this idea of a database is very much inspired by what was done in the scoping phase for the marine plan. Because while the idea of databases, they don't seem to be common as part of sustainability appraisal, you know, the Southwest Marine Plan example shows that it can be done. And it's having a database allows flexibility in the interrogation of data rather than just purely having a large report based on text and some diagrams. Our process is going to be comprehensive and systematic, but also flexible, because sustainability appraisal is used in a number of different contexts at a number of different scales, and it needs to be able to accommodate different availability of resources. We're also very keen to link to other obligations, processes and tools like the Biodiversity 2.0 metric and net gain, for example, because again, it's trying to make things streamlined and efficient. We're proposing the use of categorical ratings, you know, sort of high, medium, low, because in acknowledgement of the fact that there isn't perfect data, and sometimes it's not going to be possible to actually put numbers on things. And also traffic light summaries, you know, this red, amber, green, to help to highlight where things are most at risk and where priorities need to be set. And we are actually developing some pro forma data sheets as part of the methodological guidance. So, first part of the evidence database is the asset register, and that's about collecting information on natural capital and heritage assets. And there are sort of 3 pillars, if you like, of the natural capital approach, and that's extent, condition and spatial configuration. Extent is fairly obvious, that's area, volume, number of individuals, and condition as well. I mean, again, it's often difficult to put an actual number on this, but it can be done categorically: poor, moderate, good, for example. In some cases, there are ongoing condition assessments, such as in designated sites. And spatial configuration is quite important. And there are two elements of that. It's about things like habitat fragmentation. So, of course, while if you just looked at the extent, the total area you had of a particular type of habitat, then that might not look bad on paper. If it's just small isolated pockets, then obviously it's not going to be serving the same ecological functions as if it's contiguous or contiguous zones. But the other element of spatial configuration as well is about things being in the right place, because while things like salt marsh and woodland, they can provide ecosystem services like flood mitigation or pollution assimilation. They can only do that if they're in the right place relative to the sources of pollution and to watercourses. As well as the snapshot at the time which the sustainability appraisal is undertaken, it's also important to look at the trends across those three areas, so across extent, condition, and spatial configuration, and also to note information about why a habitat may be in a particular condition, and other issues about its status, tipping points, thresholds, that kind of thing, and any information on designations and relevant management, and of course noting data sources so that it's possible to go back to the original sources from which the information was obtained. And we're proposing that this information on natural capital assets in terms of habitats is collected based on a standard classification system. And because again, that makes the output systematic and comprehensive. And the one that we propose is using the UK habitat classification. That's proposed for the reason that it is proposed under the biodiversity 2.0 metric for net gain. So that's something that we would imagine planners and local authorities and developers are going to become very familiar with. And so it makes sense to carry that across consistently into sustainability appraisal as well. Now, obviously, UK habitat classification it only goes as far as the intertidal areas. So we've had to add in a classification of sublittoral habitats. And the other advantage of the UK habitat classification is it's an expandable hierarchy. And this allows for what I was talking about, the flexibility and allowing for different contexts and different levels of resource. Because, for example, you have at the high level the marine inlets and transitional waters category, but that splits down into rock and sediment, and then your sediments split further into things like salt marshes and mudflats and lagoons, and then you can even get down at the highest level or lowest level to different types of salt marsh. And so while you might need to get right into whether you've got Atlantic salt meadows or cord grass swards, if you're looking at an environmental impact assessment at a particular site, if you're doing a sustainability appraisal at a local authority level, then it may be around level 3 or perhaps level 4, and indeed at a national level, you might only be interested at level 2 or level 3. But if every scale of assessment uses the same framework, then it's much easier to nest and to integrate the results of different ones. There are, of course, alternative systems, for example, in the European Nature Information System, UNIS, and that's what was used or is used in Scotland's Natural Capital Asset Index. It's also potentially particularly relevant in marine because a lot of marine applications use it already, and it does go down quite a long way in terms of breaking up individual habitats. Species don't tend to have that same kind of classification, and also they're not considered by things like the biodiversity 2.0 metric, but particularly in the marine environment, with there being so many mobile species, because terrestrially things are very habitat based, but obviously in the marine system being so dynamic and three-dimensional, it's really important that mobile species which aren't necessarily connected to a specific habitat at all times are still considered. So that's why it's really important that species are considered within the framework too. But because there isn't the kind of habitat, there isn't the kind of classification hierarchy as there is for habitats, it's necessary to define context-specific lists, which should be based around protected species and also particular species that support ecosystem services, or have high non-use values, so things like fish, birds, mammals. And then, of course, there are the abiotic assets, and these, just the existence of water, rock needs to be recognised because they provide services on their own account, regardless of any living organisms. So, for example, you've got water providing fresh water for drinking irrigation, also just water bodies and their use for navigation, mineral reserves, supply aggregates, energy sources, and also landscape features such as caves and cliffs, which are used for their visual amenity and also for other recreational purposes. These don't need to be classified separately from habitats, but within the habitat classification, their existence needs to be acknowledged. And finally, there are heritage assets. Again, you'd need a context-specific list here based on sites that are designated under the National Planning Policy Framework, but also non-designated sites identified as important by local planning authorities. Having compiled the asset register, the next stage is to produce an inventory of ecosystem services. And that again is recording information about quantity and about trends, and also here about value of the goods and benefits that are derived from these ecosystem services. And that value can be in monetary terms if it exists, but also it's entirely possible to report this in other terms. It's also important to record who the beneficiaries are, and particularly how those groups of beneficiaries relate to other important areas within plans, like, for example, vulnerable groups and so on. And also looking at the scale of the benefits and also their significance, and any confidence in the information as reported. We're still working on the scales and metrics for significance and confidence, looking particularly at the way Natural England have done their significance categories in their accounts and in their natural capital asset atlases. Again, as with habitats, we're also proposing that there's a standard classification for ecosystem services, again, so that assessments are consistent and comparable. And the one we propose using is the Common International Classification of Ecosystem Services, or CITES. And the reason for this is that it's developed from a significant piece of work by the European Environment Agency. So, a lot of collective effort went into its development. And also, there are almost as many classifications as there are papers about them. And CITES is probably about as close as there is to a standard by virtue of the fact that it is widely used, including within Scotland's Natural Capital Asset Index. It's comprehensive and it includes both biotic and abiotic services, which is important because some classifications only focus on the biotic services, the things that actually stem from ecological components. But in doing a comprehensive sustainability appraisal, you can't ignore the abiotic components. Again, like the habitat classification, CITES is also an expandable hierarchy, so you can use it as different levels depending on the resolution of data that you have or that you need or that you can deal with. However, the way that CITES is set up is not actually the most user-friendly categories and descriptions. So what we've actually done is taken a high-level framework, slightly modified, that the Natural England have used, and then we've mapped CITES 5.1 individual classes onto that framework. And we also added in carrier services in reflection of the use of waterways for transport, because again, you can't do a comprehensive assessment if you're not including shipping and things like defence uses. And what's important within the natural capital approach is trying to get past this sort of siloed presentation of information and make it link better together. And so the next step is putting together a matrix that links the assets to the ecosystem services so that it becomes clear which assets are required to deliver the ecosystem services that are important in a particular area. And so here down on the left are the different types of habitats, and then the services run across the top. And there's a score in each box that shows the potential of that habitat to deliver that particular service. And that quickly highlights which ones have the most potential, and then can be used to identify where there needs to be a focus on ensuring that habitats are protected in order to maintain the flow of services. And then the next step is to understand what the possible impacts on assets and services are. And so to look at the existing threats to their extent and condition. And that allows you to identify those assets that are of greatest risk, and so prioritise management. And so the development of an asset register actually follows some of the steps that have already been done developing the sustainability appraisal up until this point. So the first thing to do is define natural capital asset classes, which has already been done for the asset register. Determine the asset benefit relationships, again, already done for the asset service matrix. And then to establish targets and acceptability limits. And these are expected to be those that already exist for policy targets and quality standards. So things like, looking at increases in stocks or, bathing water quality, for example. And then by combining information on the status of the benefit and its trend, you can determine the risk score as per the matrix at the bottom, which shows, for example, that if the trend in the status of your asset is positive or not moving, and it's currently at or above the policy target, then it's at low risk. Whereas anything that has a strongly negative trend or is substantially below target is likely to be at high risk. And what you get out of this is this kind of output, which across the 3 dimensions of status, quantity, quality, and spatial configuration, you get a traffic light summary highlighting where there's low risk, medium, and high risk. And it's important to split it out across those 3 elements, because if you look at the woodlands there, for example, while it's low risk in terms of the quantity, it gets into medium risk in terms of spatial configuration for its continued delivery of benefits related to recreation, hazard protection, and wildlife. And so you can then use this information to develop a comprehensive sustainability appraisal framework, because through the process to compile the asset and risk registers and the wider evidence database, you'll understand what the current status and trends are in assets, ecosystem services and benefits, the degree to which they're at risk, and also the activities most likely to impact upon them. And this allows the definition of detailed, explicit sustainability objectives for natural capital assets. It also informs those related to other capitals, particularly in terms of the interactions and the impacts of activities on assets and services. And because you've got a substantial database and understanding that data and what quantitative data is available, that allows the definition of indicators, management targets, and status thresholds. So we've tested this so far most comprehensively in the Marine Natural Capital Plan, where we derived a framework of objectives across the 5 capitals. And we also produce an output summary for the asset register showing the extent trend and also the condition information, and also an ecosystem services summary. So, and you can see from that how, while there's lots of quantified information and indeed monetary values for things like commercial fish landings and also to a degree for recreation, across a lot of the other ecosystem services, there wasn't that kind of quantified information that was needed. So it just had to be reported in categorical terms. And what's happening next is we're going to continue to test the methods and also to develop the precise database format, and to try and get more land and freshwater examples through ongoing work on the North Devon local plan case study and with Natural England and the Landscape Pioneer. Because while this is this was started under the Marine Pioneer, it's very important that the process is applicable across all habitats, so that it's something that is likely to actually be taken up. Also doing more work on data and indicators, again looking at the work, basing this on the work that Natural England's already done in its natural capital atlases. Looking more about heritage, because that is not our particular area of expertise, but fortunately we do have external help on this. And looking at the method for how to appraise different plan options against the natural capital framework. We did this to an extent for the Marine Natural Capital Plan by looking at plan versus no plan options in the short and long term, and looking at whether the impacts of the plan were positive, negligible, or negative. And finally, completing the guidance. So as well as the reports and conceptual frameworks, actual sort of how-to steps and better summaries of information to make it more usable. There are some outputs so far. There's a report and then a shorter paper about using the natural capital approach in the marine environment generally. With regard to the actual sustainability appraisal, there's a current version of what I'm calling a draft discussion document where I sort of lay out the thinking and the method as developed so far, and also the example from the North Devon Marine Natural Capital Plan. And then we also have 2 workshop reports that show how we work with the stakeholders to get the process underway. Thank you.